Hello everybody, Shashwat aka Mystic Monk. Welcome to the channel. Um, so this is going to be a new series where we are going to talk about the basics of photography. Uh, when I relaunched this channel, I did a poll on Facebook and on Instagram, and I asked people what they would like to see in this channel, and the majority, my wife, yeah, so we'll just give me a sec. Okay, so we are back. So as I was saying, I did a kind of a poll, and most of you told me that you would like to know the basics of photography, the same kind of thing that I teach in my photography 101 lessons, and maybe more. So this series on my channel is going to be all about photography. I mean, all about the basics of photography, all the technicalities of it. So let's start. So when we talk about photography, or when we hold a camera and we want to take a picture or make an exposure, we need to figure out certain things like the parameters on our cameras, on what levels those parameters should be set. I hope everyone knows that how a DSLR or a mirrorless camera or a digital camera, or if you are still using film, thumbs up to you, and if you guys are still using film, I hope that you know that there are certain toggles or settings that are to be set properly to get a decent exposure, or to get an exposure that you want. And speaking in those lines, there are basically three things that we have to take into account. The first being the aperture, the second being the shutter, and the third being the ISO. But before we get into what aperture is, how does it work, what shutter is, how does that work, or what ISO is, let us just talk in brief about what exposure is. So in this digital age, when we refer to an image or to a photograph, what we are seeing on the back of our cameras or on the back of our mobile screens is a processed image. Back in the days of film, we actually had to process the image. The film would expose the image, and then it had to be taken into a lab where it was developed, or a dark room where it was developed, and only then we could see the image. So this whole procedure in this digital age has been made simple. These days all we have to do is get the settings correct, press the shutter button, and we have a developed image in form of a JPEG. Or if we are shooting RAW, then we get a preview of that image in JPEG. So let us just talk about exposure. If you are beginning, if you are learning the art of photography, then this is something that you should always have in mind. What is an exposure? An exposure is basically the imprint that gets laid upon the camera's sensor, and based on the amount of light, the amount of sensitivity, and on what shutter speed the camera was set on, the sensor of the camera will compute certain things, and it will produce an image. image that the sensor of the camera sees is, in this modern day and age, the exposure. Basically, in all our devices, well, I use a mirrorless camera. If we switch on our cameras, we can see, if this focuses, I hope, yes, it focused. So we can see over here, we have a meter kind of a thing with 0 and plus numerals 1 and 2 to one side, and negative numerals 1 and 2 to another side, with lots of gradations. So that thing is an exposure meter. You can also find the same when you look through the viewfinder. Every camera has it in a different fashion. Now this exposure meter gives us a readout as to what our current settings of our camera are giving us. How do we set it to a proper exposure, or how do we know if our camera is giving us a correct readout of a proper or a decent exposure? Is we have to keep the meter somewhere between 0 and minus 1/3 or 2/3, or plus 1/3 or 2/3, depending on the situation and depending on what you are focusing at. If you want to preserve the highlights and boost the shadows later on in post-production, then you would choose to keep it somewhere between 0 and negative 2/3. And if you don't want to preserve the highlights and you want to blow them apart, blow them off, not too much though, because if you blow the highlights too much, you won't be able to recover it, then you would be choosing a positive exposure. Now, how do we set the said exposure meter to what we want? So in the beginning of the video, I told you that there are 3 parameters that are to be set: the aperture, the shutter, and ISO. So in the next lesson, we would deal with aperture, and we would see what it does and how it works. Mystic Monk signing off. Bye bye.